You and I, we are storytellers, we're story seekers. We love every form of storytelling that there is. I love books, I love movies, I love shows, I love music, I love audiobooks, I love every medium for telling stories. But there is one that tends to be a little bit exaggeratory when it comes to the details of a historical significance, and that is Hollywood with their television shows and their movie films. I sound like an old man, but they tend to lie a lot. It's a get off my lawn moment for Hollywood. They tend to tell a lot of lies, and whether that's to make things more interesting, to save money on props, or whether it's just that they don't care about the integrity of storytelling, there are some historical things that they get absolutely wrong 80% of the time, and I'm going to talk about the 5 things that Hollywood lies about constantly that really irritates me. Here we go. Number 5. It's dirty peasants everywhere you go. In old movies and films, if you're a peasant or a farmer, it's dirt all over the face, dirt all the way up the arms. These people didn't not know that they had dirt on themselves. It wasn't a huge issue of peasants not understanding that if you had water or shit on your face, you went and you washed it off. This wasn't an epidemic of filth that stretched throughout all of human history, that if you didn't have money, you didn't understand that water washed off dirt. I mean, rarely in occasions where you had places that were water dry, where you didn't have a whole lot of groundwater, maybe people might have been a little bit more dirty. But in these films, they always lived near rivers and the ocean and all of these other mediums of giant bodies of water, as though these people don't understand. You can take a trip down to the local river and just splash on the face. As a matter of fact, it was such a problem that people would bathe in rivers that a lot of rivers became toxic. Have you ever visited the Thames in England? Oh my god, there is still shit literal human fecal matter in the Thames from the 1700s. There is 300-year-old shit in the bottom of the Thames. That's how much people went and bathed and left their refuse in water. So this idea of filthy peasants in every form of television and movie media is just absolutely one of my pet peeves with films. And believe me, friends, they may not be as petty as that one, but they only get worse from here. Let's move on to number 4. Number 4 is armour and clothing. They just get this wrong so often. The majority of people wore tunics of some kind. If you're talking about England and Scotland, they wore linnaeus. If you go back a little bit further, again, it's usually just like a form of loose fit trousers and a tunic, a linnae, a long shirt that was belted in the middle, and that was it. That's what people generally wore. But you get all of these people who are wearing massive furs and leather, and it's such an unbelievable facet of the way that people wore clothing. And armour gets to be even worse when you're talking about historical armour. And I'm not talking about things like Lord of the Rings. I'm not talking about high fantasy. I'm talking about films that are meant to represent some level of historical accuracy, like Braveheart and like the Arthurian movies. Because Arthurian movies are meant to be a little bit high fantasy, but they're also supposed to be reflective of English and British history. There's supposed to be some historical aspect to it, and this is always wrong. You have people in loose-fitting, like flexible leather armour. Flexible leather armour was not something that people wore on a regular basis. First of all, it doesn't breathe, so you're going to be sweating like a mother, and it does nothing to stop blades or arrows. The most common types of armour worn by people who fought in these eras was usually chainmail because it was cheap enough to get and it was relatively easy to make by an individual. So if people had armour of any kind, it was usually a type of mail. And if you had full plate armour, you were usually someone of significant importance. And full plate armour was incredibly difficult to fight in. So you don't see a whole lot of examples, at least not outwardly, of people having fought in full armour. But you see that all the time in these films. Just people walking around in 300-pound suits of armour. It's just not, and if we're talking about Lord of the Rings again, or we're talking about World of Warcraft, yeah, I'll take it, it's fine. We can say that those people are running around in that kind of armour. But when we're talking about like a Robin Hood film, and people are running around in full plate, it's ridiculous. These things just didn't happen. And I'm more than happy to suspend disbelief. But these are things that are easy enough to fix. These are things that you could easily fit into the story and add a little bit of historical accuracy, rather than having people running around thinking that everyone had hard leather armour and they were filthy peasants all the time. And I know I'm just bitching, but it gets worse from here. Alright, number 3 steers a little bit away from the themality of realism in historical films, films that have historical relevance to them, but I just can't get away from this very, very angst-filled detail for me that is almost always gotten wrong, and that is Thor. Thor from the Norse pantheon, Thor, the son of Odin, Thor, the mighty thunder god, is not a blonde, and he never was. Thor was a flaming fiery redhead. This man had hair that was like the locks of flames licking off of the sun itself. He was a ginger. Thor was a mighty body-built ginger who had a temper on him. And his personality, first of all, Thor's personality is almost never gotten correct to what we understand from the sagas and from the Eddas. Thor, yes, was a bit of a hothead, but it's always put in a way that is either it's meant to be comedic relief, like with the Marvel films, him being a hothead, or in like the God of War games, he's just an outright, I want to start a fight with everybody. Doesn't really fit with what we know of Thor. Yes, he was quick to battle, but it was almost always for a reason, whether it was for the respect of his family, the respect of his wife, or the respect of the Aesir in general. Those were the things that generally he would be battle-esque, he would be warlike about. It wasn't just he'd fly off the handle and fight anybody for any reason, though he did have a particular hate for the tribe of the Jotun, which we can talk about that in another video. Now, the reason why I think that we have blonde Thor is because of the Germanic mythologies surrounding this, where Thor is referred to as Donner, and Donner was blonde, and those were Germanic translations of Norwegian and Icelandic tales, and they came about much, much later. We don't see the first appearance of Donner until far after we see the first mentions of the early Thor and Odin stories. And I think, and this is just a guess on my part, so I'm not going to say that this is absolute fact, and I think that the reason why we have this perception that Thor was a pretty blonde is because of Marvel Comics. In the 30s and 40s, Marvel Comics designed Thor after the teachings or the writings that surrounded Donner and the Valkyries. And I believe that that is where the depiction of the early Valkyrie character and Donner came from, because we don't actually get anywhere else where the Valkyries are perceived to be the way that they are written in Marvel Comics, nor do we see Thor anywhere else written that way except for in Marvel Comics and in Germanic translations of these myths, Germanic versions of these myths. So I believe that the perpetuation of Thor in the Marvel Comics is how we ended up with that stereotype that Thor was a blonde. And I know I ranted about this one for far too long, but it's just one of those things that gets me every single time. There are two places where Thor is actually ginger. It's in the God of War games and in Records of Ragnarok. And in Records of Ragnarok, he virtually looks like a woman. So it is just one of those things that irks me every single time, but not quite as much as number 2. Number 2, it should be obvious at this point since we've gone into the Norse mythology, and that is horned helms from the Scandinavian folk. Scandinavian soldiers never had horned helms. There are very few examples of horned helms throughout history because they'd be terribly impractical. Helmets were designed to deflect blows. So if you had a giant pair of horns sitting on either side of your head, you're not deflecting blows away from your very tender and sensitive skull that contains your very important brain. No, instead you are deflecting blows into your very important brain, which would then presume that your brain wasn't all that important to begin with because you were deflecting blows into it. But there are no horned helms in Norse history. There are very few examples of horned helms in history at all. I think might be some from old Mesopotamian depictions in artwork, but no, there are no significant examples of horned helms throughout history, though if I remember any in the editing process, I will be sure to include them in the little tidbits down below, the story bites that appear at the bottom of the screen. Now, number one is the entire reason why I decided to make this video, why I decided to tell this ranty story about what Hollywood tends to lie about incessantly. You know what, I just realized that both examples of Thor being a ginger do not come from Hollywood. They come from the gaming industry and from the anime community, which is hilarious. That is absolute comedy to me. Anyways, this is the whole entire reason why I decided to make this video, and that's that whenever you have a medieval fight scene, whenever you have an ancient battle between superpowers, it's like Oprah for swords. You get a sword, you get a sword, you get a sword, everybody gets a sword, everybody's got swords, when in reality, very few people had. So there are so few surviving examples of swords that are more than a few hundred years old, because not only did very few people have them, there weren't a lot of swords to have survived throughout history. It's not just that people didn't have them, they were very difficult to make well in a time before we can measure carbon content in steel. This is one of the reasons why Celtic blades and Norse blades ended up surviving a lot longer, because there was a tradition of putting carbon, which was actually the ashes of ancestors, using the ashes of ancestors to forge jewelry and blades and shields and other pieces of armor. The reason why these survive for so long is because those ashes, those burnt people, it's extra carbon. So when they used the ashes in the forging process, they would end up adding carbon to the blades, and this would allow the blades to be stronger, and it would allow them to last longer, and they would have fewer flaws in them, and they wouldn't deteriorate as quickly. But the swords were so ridiculously expensive. There were three ways you got a blade. You stole it, you given it, or you had enough money to have one made yourself. I'm sorry, 4 ways. Or you made one for yourself. Those were the 4 ways that you got yourself a sword. The most common weapons in the time period, let's say 900 to 1500, were spears and axes. And the reason why is a spear had excellent reach. It could be wielded without a significant amount of experience. You could take a very inexperienced soldier, put a spear in his hand, and he could wield a spear with some level of mastery, because they were not difficult weapons to use on the field. They had range on their side, and they didn't take as much metal to make. So you had short tip spears, long tip spears, javelins. These were the more common type of weaponry you'd see on the battlefield, especially in Europe and in Asia. Spears were ridiculously common in this time, and the reason why axes are such a staple of the Norse people is because the Norse people, when they were raiding, when they were out going a Viking, they would take with them farm tools including hand axes and of course wood cutting axes or bearded axes. And the reason why they had these axes was so that they could build when they got to where they were going, so that they could provide themselves shelter when they got where they were going. They had a multi-use utilitarian purpose, and they also doubled as fairly effective weapons on the battlefield, especially long-handled axes and throwing axes. Though throwing axes were not incredibly common, and short single-hand axes were fairly common in like the 1100s to the 1300s, but not as common, again, as Hollywood have us believe. Most people, most fighters, most warriors had spears, not swords. And this gets me every single time. And I know, I'm being petty, I'm being whiny, I'm just talking about things that most people probably don't care about. But I care that you can't have That you can't have an army of peasants, people who have very little money of their own, no land to their name, and fucking 500 of them have swords. Where did they get them? And trust me, there were no lords or kings that were keeping stockpiles of very valuable steel in swords beneath their castles. These giant armories filled with swords. It's so ridiculously fake and exaggerated. And I get it, it's for production value. I understand. It's for production value. But it's just as much production value to give everybody a spear. Alright, I'm done with my complaining. Is there anything that happens in Hollywood films that is so historically inaccurate that it just climbs right up your sphincter and it tickles you until you're irritated? Please let me know in the kilt section down below. Thank you so much for joining me for this incredibly irreverent rant, and I hope that you will join me the next time for the next story here in the tavern. Stay bloodthirsty, my friends, and remember, all hail the Black Dragons. I'll see you next time.